didn't know what was going on today. I just strolled in, and Brother Jeff asked me to preach a sermon, and I guess I'll have to get ready right now. Well, it's very good to be here this morning with you, worship with you, study with you, and of course this lesson was designed a little bit in part at the 1:30 hour, of course, but things happen, and you roll with the punches, as they say. And today, this morning, we're going to be looking at what submission is not. Okay, what submission is not. The word submission takes on different forms grammatically in the Greek New Testament. All of them are verbs, and the first of them, it means to be in submission. And it's the idea of being inclined to or willing to submit to the orders or wishes of another. That's one of the first definitions of the word submission, the way that it's used, right? In the Christian's case, it is to God. So this is a word used by James in the book of James, chapter 4, verse 7, when he says, "Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Okay? Being willing to or inclined to, being submissive to the wishes or orders of someone else. Again, in the Christian's case, it is God. So when James says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God," he said, place yourselves under the order of, or the wishes of, the desires of God. That's one of the first definitions of the way that it's used. Another way that it is used, it means to be subjugated, which means to be made or to make subservient, forced to submit or subdue. It is a forcing, if you will. And the only time that one is used is in direct context to us making ourselves submissive. It is not used in the case of God making us submissive. It is used in the case of us making ourselves submissive. This is where it's used. It's found in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, where he says, "Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." So it's showing in this verse that the only one who is forcing us to be submissive is ourselves. God is not forcing you and me to be submissive. God does not force you and I to serve Him. He does not force us to enact our covenant relationship with Him insofar as the Great Commission. Really, insofar as anything. He doesn't force us to go out and spread the gospel. He doesn't force us to talk to our families about Jesus. He doesn't force us to try to network with people and try to say, "Look, your life has struggles in it. Mine does too. But yet God has answers. He has solutions. Sometimes the problems we don't even think to ask. Sometimes solutions to problems we don't even know about yet." He doesn't force us to do any of that. But yet God does tell us it is our responsibility to submit ourselves. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, as we had looked at, he says, "Submit yourselves, therefore, to your elders." Okay? And then he also says, "Yes, all of you be submissive to one another." Submit yourselves to one another. Okay? That's another way that it is used. The last way we see it used in the New Testament is to be subjugated, which means to be or become brought under the dominion or authority of another. That's found in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 22, which says, "Who has gone into heaven," that's Jesus, "and is at the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him." Okay? Though this word submission in various forms is showing what the textbook definition of submission is. And that's all well and good. It's something we need to know. But from Scripture and the context of it, you and I can tell what submission is by looking at what it's not. seen over the course of the gospel meeting, right, the lectureship really, that we're seeing what things are not. And later on today, we'll also see what a few more things are not. But yet you can also tell what it is by looking at what it's not. Take any lesson you have heard so far. You can tell what faith is by looking at what it's not. You can tell who God is by looking at who He's not. You can tell what the church is by looking at what the church is not. And you can tell what submission is by looking at what it is not. Brethren, friends, submitting to God, this is important, submitting to God does not relinquish, I'm going to use those air quotes, does not relinquish any power we think we have. But it is an act that shows we desire to relish in God's protective sovereign nature. In other words, a lot of people don't want to submit themselves unless they grit their teeth and they have to. And it shows that they don't want to be under anybody's thumb or power because they see it as an act of weakness. Many people think things like emotions or men crying is an act of weakness. No, it is not. Showing emotion does not mean weakness, and neither does submission. Being in submission to God is not weakness, which is going to be one of our points. But it does not, we do not relinquish any power we think we have. So, we're going to look at three different things, but the first one, we're going to use a very technical term. You ready? Submission is not wishy-washy. Very technical term, I know. I got it from the dictionary. It is not wishy-washy. So two details that cannot be overlooked. And if you will, and if you would like to, let's turn to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. But two details that cannot be overlooked is that of conviction and decisiveness. Those are two details that cannot be overlooked. Conviction and decisiveness. Being in submission to God does not mean we lack conviction and become indecisive. Brethren, when you and I become Christians, it doesn't even have to do with God or any religion of the Bible itself. And really what it boils down to is being a decisive and convicted person. Do you have a passion for something? Well, everyone should say yes, right? But are we decisive as people? Can we make a decision? How about where to decide for lunch? And if you got 5 people trying to decide where you want to go for lunch, and all 5 go, I don't know, it's kind of up to you guys. Well, I don't know, it's kind of up to you guys. You're going to stand in circles just saying it's up to you, and you're never going to eat, and you're going to starve. Being a decisive person is important. Making a decision is important. Sometimes it's the wrong decision, but at least you're a decisive person, and you can learn from mistakes. We as Christians need to be convicted and decisive. But being in submission to God doesn't mean that anybody lacks conviction, and it doesn't mean somebody's indecisive. Unfortunately, that's what people believe when they look at Christians. Well, you're just people who are weak and you need God to make yourselves feel better. That's why you submit yourself to the Lord. No, that's not why. We're going to look at why we submit ourselves to God. But being a Christian is not submission is not wishy-washy. It's deliberate, it's intentional, and a submissive heart is one that is steadfast and one that is resolute. It is dedicated. The individual who is submitted to God is dedicated to a higher calling or purpose. You ever sang the song, I am resolved? I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler. Right? Why do we sing that? Why do we sing that? Why does the song leader choose that? Because we're resolved. I am resolved. It doesn't say we are resolved. It says I am resolved. When we sing that individually but together, we are proclaiming through praise, through song, that you individually and I individually are resolved to do what? To be decisive for God. To be submitted to God. We are resolved no longer to live. We're determined. We're focused. We're passionate. And that passion can never die. Because if it does, we will become wishy-washy. When we sing that song, we're singing it because we're talking about being steadfast. determined not to be turned away by the charms of the world. Even when Satan seems to be throwing it right in front of our faces, like that little carrot. And it's just right here. And he's telling them, you just reach out for it, you try to bite it. Or it's right here in your face, and I'm not letting you get past it. I'm not letting you move without seeing what it is you're missing. Even when he does that. So in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, in the New King James, it says this: Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding. Well, Paul is saying, look, if you want to abound in the work of the Lord, what can't you be? You can't be wishy-washy. You can't be on the fence. Why can't you be on the fence? Because when you sit on the fence, or sometimes people lay on it, you're going to get impaled. You're going to get impaled. You be steadfast. You be immovable. That's how you abound in the work of the Lord. Paul didn't become wishy-washy by putting Christ on in baptism. He didn't put him on in baptism to continue living a life in which he believed, well, I can just kind of figure this out as I go along and be a little bit decisive and indecisive at other times. He grew. He abounded. Paul wasn't wishy-washy. He was a beacon of steadfastness. And brethren, in the fast-paced nature of our world today, with the constantly changing trends, fashion always changes. I don't know fashion all that well. My wife picked out this wonderful suit. Not me. I went to her and said, what tie would you believe just goes with all this? I said, I want you to pick this out. She goes, well, I want to go with the hummingbirds. I said, that's a wonderful idea. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Okay? Fashion trends change all the time. But you also have the constant flow of information. Information changes. I remember when I was a kid, okay, yeah, sure, cell phones were a thing. It wasn't as popular. You still had the landline with the cord you can wrap around your house 7 times. And still be on the phone. And still go to your room, close the door, and it still work. Right? But flow of information changes. It adapts, it grows. But that type of thing, that fast-paced nature, the constant change, that can tempt us to waver in our convictions because it can be easier. It can always be easier to do something different. God didn't design these things for you and me to make it easy. He made it so we could be right with Him. And at times, sure, it's easy. How easy is it to come together and be faithful? Well, it's a lot easier together. It's easier to submit to God's will when you have the preacher preaching it, pounding the pulpit, walking around. I can't do that today, but walking around, using hand motions, acting with passion. It's easy. Easier. But brethren, submission in the Christian sense means to be or having a steadfast commitment to God's principles, even when it's countercultural. Even when it's unpopular. This means you and I are not afraid of cancel culture. We're not afraid of being canceled. Why shouldn't we be afraid of cancel culture? You realize it's nothing new. Cancel culture's been around, sure, as of recent years with the name, but cancel culture for Christians has been around since our master was born of a virgin. Herod tried to kill him. God said, that ain't going to happen. He was tried to be killed many times by the Jews and the religious leaders. He said, ain't going to happen. He willingly gave himself up. You can even just imagine Satan believing he canceled Jesus, the Son of God, when he died on the cross. What do you think happens 3 days later when he rises again? Hope is solidified forever. Submission to God is proven without a shadow of a doubt that God has not only kept His promises for centuries, not only fulfilled all of the prophecies He said He was going to fulfill. Jesus didn't just establish the law. now, there's a way for life, our life, to be lived in submission with all the trials and tribulations we go through. For those trials and tribulations to work for us instead of against us. We can look at life and we can look at those trials and say, you know what? That's a learning lesson, not a hindrance. When you have the right perspective, we'll have the right purpose. And if we have the right purpose, we're going to get to the right place. That's heaven. Cancel culture isn't anything new, but when society's morals or values shift away from biblical teachings, as it always has, instead of being swayed by the popular opinion, we ground ourselves in the Word. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. Be ye steadfast. I want King James there. Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing your labor is not in vain in the Lord. For instance, if the cultural norm promotes revenge masked with this idea of just love your neighbor, just love. But it promotes revenge, and the same people promoting love are the same ones who are shouting hate to people who don't agree with them. What do we do then? We promote forgiveness and what love means. We describe in detail what love in the Bible means. Agape love, sacrificial love, desiring the best for the object of your affection. We promote forgiveness. We have the thought process of I am ready to forgive. In personal choices, from career moves to relationship decisions, are we submitting to God by seeking His guidance and being constant in prayer and reflection, even when easier options tempt us? It's a lot easier to go to God after the fact. Thinking, well, He's just going to bless me because He's got to make a way for something to happen because He's faithful. Oh, it's not how it works. It's not an employer-employee relationship. It's not how it works. Do we go to God first? There's always going to be some commercial. There's always going to be someone trying to sell us on what provides comfort if we rely on them to get it. There's always going to be the 1995 by the televangelist. It's always going to be there. But we don't need to rely on man's wisdom. We need to rely on Scripture. There isn't any room for being on the fence, because as we said, if we're on the fence, we just might be impaled by it. We can't be wishy-washy. Submission is not wishy-washy, my brethren. But it's also not wasteful. That's point number 2. It's not wasteful. Now, when we say wasteful, we are saying that in a spiritual context, it means neglecting or underutilizing the blessings and resources God has blessed us with. Now, before we read this, let's turn to Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Now, before we read this, we'll continue to preface a couple of things. Okay? Excuse me. Matthew 25, 14 through 30. Okay? Now, in the broader framework of submission, talk about not being wasteful. It's the failure to harness our God-given potential, talents, and opportunities, which is the same thing as saying we're squandering God's blessings to us. Okay? That's what we're saying. This concept plagues so many people's minds, but it's everywhere. You ever seen Law and Order? You ever watch NCIS? There's always somebody in those shows like that, without fail, they're getting into an ordeal or predicament and it sparks an investigation, and the only thing they can do is desk work. And that character is always feeling like, man, I need to have my talents utilized. I'm not built for being behind a desk. I'm not built for X, Y, or Z. They feel like it's a waste of their time and abilities. And similarly, we can feel what the congregation does to further the gospel may be beneath us, or a waste of our time and talent. Well, we're not going to door knock. That hasn't worked in 40 years. What about now? Are we sure it hasn't? Have we tried it? Well, I don't think this potluck's going to work because no one's going to show up. Have we tried it? Or is it just the same people who have been doing it for the past 20 years? But in the church, all over the Lord's church, all over deals with this. It's plagued so many people's minds. the benevolence work, the kingdom work, the evangelistic work, the edification work. If not everyone's on board, not everybody's going to reap the benefits. Consider this principle. You remember the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do to you? Well, what happens if you take a group of 10 people and you told them to do that, and each one of them looked out for somebody else instead of themselves? Guess what? All of them are looked out for. But what happens if one of those 10 people starts going, you know what, I'm tired of this. I want to look out for myself. Well, the person they're looking out for doesn't have anybody looking out for them. And what happens? Well, he's not looking out for me. No one else is looking out for me. I'm doing what I can to look out for somebody else. You know what? It's high time I look out for me. And pretty soon, instead of 10 people looking out for one another, you got 10 people looking out for themselves. And we consider, brethren, that sometimes this is the reason why we may not trust one another. Remember in 1 Peter chapter 3 that we talked about? Looking at the definitions of submission, 1 Peter 5, verse 5. It said, likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to the elders, right? Yes, all of you be submissive to one another. When we don't submit ourselves to one another, you can guarantee that the golden rule is not being practiced. And when that's not being practiced, that's a good indication that somebody or multiple people have a hard time trusting someone else to look out for them. Because in the past, someone hasn't. And brethren, when you talk about submission, that's kind of a hard habit to break. But regardless, we still need to break it, because submission is not a waste of the talents that we have, that God gives us. Right? We've seen things this weekend like worship, baptism, faith, what it is not. But one thing we can take away from all of them, and you can see them in the next few lessons, one thing you can take away from all of them is that they are not unnecessary. All of them are needed. All of the topics discussed, even though we're looking at what it is not, all of those things are still needed by the church. Still needed. It's not a waste of our time to learn enough to be able to teach it. It's not a waste of time to learn how to song lead, my brothers and sisters. It's not a waste of time to learn how to evangelize, my brethren. It's not a waste of time to learn how to lead prayers or learn to lead the Lord's Supper or to preach. It's not a waste of time. It's not. God has given each one of us the ability to do certain things, sure. And everything we are to do, we should do to the glory of God, absolutely. But let's read the parable of the talents and notice a couple things. Let's read together. Matthew 25, 14 through 30. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, and to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. And likewise he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you have delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents beside them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He also, who had received the 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents beside them. His Lord said to them, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you'd be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there, you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gathered where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now I know the word talent here does not refer to the talents we have. It's monetary value in this parable. right? But there's that principle that still remains. We have still been given abilities by God to do certain things. The church is built by the people, and the people are individually placed by God. Why? Because God adds us to the church. You can't join it. God adds us. But let's be honest and practical. If we don't want to be wasteful in our submission to God's will, we need to realize that we don't know the fullest extent of our talents unless we've tried to develop more. How do we know the one talent man couldn't have developed another one? How do we know he couldn't have made another one? He believed he couldn't, so does that mean he couldn't? No. Brethren, when we live our lives, and sometimes maybe we have said this, I've said this, maybe we've heard this. Well, I'm not a preacher. I'm not a song leader. How do you know? You see, being a song leader or preacher doesn't mean you have to be the best speaker. He doesn't have to be you have to be the best orator. Being a song leader doesn't mean you have to have the most angelic voice that the brotherhood has ever heard. But how do we know that that's not a talent of ours if we don't try to develop it? If we haven't honestly tried. Well, if we don't want to be wasteful, we need to realize we haven't reached the fullest extent, and we need to try to develop more. My wife was reading a book called Atomic Habits, and it was written by a man named James Clear. And he has a quote in here that I think is very applicable. And he says this: when you're looking for something you love, he says you have fewer commitments and more experimentations. Okay? Understand what I mean? You have fewer commitments, but you're experimenting more and more to try to find what it is that you love. You love to work with your hands? You'll try carpentry. Maybe you try welding. Maybe you'll try mason work or blacksmithing. Something. You'll just try different things. Right? More experimentations, fewer commitments. But he says this: once you found something you love, you have more commitments and fewer experimentations. When you find it, you hold it. Have you ever gone and asked someone what they're passionate about? What do you love to do? And someone just, even if it's someone who doesn't talk that much, they just start going on about what it is they love to do. You love to quilt? Awesome. You love sports? Amazing. You love working with your hands? Okay, you're a builder. And they just talk and go, and it's amazing. That's what we're talking about. It's like this: a water reservoir. It's great to provide water for the people when they need it. But if it gets stagnant because it's never used, because it's never cleaned or maintained, the resource becomes useless. Brethren, we can't let our talents get useless, especially the ones we don't even know we have yet. If we don't know what we have, others may not experience the glory of God that they could have if we learn to develop that talent. It's all about glorifying God. So what's the solution for that? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's three things: acknowledge, advance, apply. Acknowledge. Every once in a while, you and I need to reassess our talents. We need to sit down and reassess the things that we can do, that we love to do, and don't think that taking time for yourself, meditating on what you can do to flourish your talents, is not a waste of time. And it's not hippie-ish either. It's self-reflection. It's not prideful to recognize that God gave you abilities. Now, if you go around telling everybody you need to bring it up in a conversation all the time, all right, sure, we'll talk. But it's not prideful to recognize you have them. Just because you want to advance in it and apply it isn't prideful. It's not a waste of time, it's necessary. And then when you acknowledge that, you advance. What was the problem with the one-talent man? It wasn't ability. It was attitude. It was not ability, it was attitude. He did not advance, it was his attitude. He did not care to try to advance the talent beyond his own laziness. We should want to glorify God, and that means using what we have at our disposal. Okay? How do you develop in something like preaching? Go to a workshop. You want to develop in song leading? Go to someone who's done it before. Go to someone who has experience and finally apply. Brethren, we need to change our perspective on the word leverage. Leverage our brethren. It's not a bad thing to lean upon them and use them to grow ourselves. Iron sharpens iron, doesn't it not? Iron sharpens iron. We need to use our brethren to help us and help God to reach the masses, if you will, to be ambassadors for Christ by growing. What does all that have to do with submission? Being in submission to God means maximizing His word for our soul. He didn't give us talents to simply have a better living experience. He gave it to us so we could glorify Him. If we're setting our goal on heaven, we're not going to be the people who bury our talent in the ground. We're going to use it to make more so our Master is glorified and praised. And finally, it's not weakness. In today's culture, independence and self-sufficiency are highly prized. People see submission as a sign of weakness. They fear they'll be viewed as a pushover or lack of backbone or weak. But true Christian submission is about recognizing a greater purpose in ourselves. It's not weak. Many equate that act of submission, especially to God, as acknowledgement of personal weakness. It's a huge misunderstanding. Submission is a profound act of humility. It is acknowledging God's infinite wisdom over my finite nature. Sure, submitting to God is part of recognizing how weak we are by ourselves, but above that, it demonstrates reliability. It demonstrates that we can show God and others we can be trusted. Consider passages like 1 Corinthians 4:2. It says, moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. Found is the key word. It means and implies the necessity of being proven by one's actions. What about Luke 16:10? It says this, he who is faithful in what is least is also faithful in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is also unfaithful in much. The point is, in that passage, that earthly wealth does not belong to us, but to God. How can we have an earthly home if we are not righteous with what God has given us and our earthly possessions? So what kind of person do we need to be? Reliable. We need to be a reliable one and can demonstrate the resolve to be reliable. Someone who does not see submission as a weakness, but sees where God's throne is and knows that they are but a humble servant. We don't need to be the most recognizable member of the body of Christ at large in the congregation. We need to keep our head down, nose in the Scripture, and be working daily to show our reliability to God, which is an active way to show our submission to God. And brethren, I'll leave you with this. It's like we said at the beginning together. Submission to God does not relinquish any power we think we have, but it is an act. That shows we desire to relish in God's protection, protective, sovereign nature. Submission is not wishy-washy. It's not wasteful. It's not weak. And all the topics that have been preached this past weekend, if they all, faith, baptism, worship, all of this, if they have a proper place and a proper perspective in our heart, our mind, our soul, that is how we can actively show submission to Almighty God. Is that the kind of mind that we have this morning? Or is that the kind of mind we may be struggling to have at this very moment? If you have that need, won't you come as we are dismissed at this time, or as we sing praises to God, whatever we would be doing. But thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention. May God bless all of us as we work and labor